Probably my favorite Mennonite joke is the Mennonite who got rescued from a desert island, and the rescuers came and got him, and he was very happy to see them, and they made sure he was okay and attended to him and gave him some food, and then they looked around and they said, "Oh, I know you've been here a long time, but why are there 3 little huts?" And he said, "Oh yeah, well, that one over there is my house." "Okay, well, that makes sense that you would need shelter. But there's 2 other ones. What about this one?" "Oh," he says, that's where I go to church." "Okay, yeah, but then what about the other one?" He said, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church."
I love that joke. But deep down, it's a little painful because it perfectly illustrates the church that I was born into. I was born into a church that splits, a church that some would say is destined to divide. And mine did, when I was just 2 years old. This is the story of 2 churches, but it's also my story. It's my story of searching for my place in a church divided and finding it in the in-between spaces. It's my story of searching for answers, of trying to understand why the 2 groups that raised me, the Mennonites and the Mennonite Brethren, are so often at loggerheads, and what caused them to split in the first place. If you've ever longed to find belonging in a church torn apart by fragmenting identities, by haunting memory, and by changing ideas, you've come to the right place. I'm Marnie Klassen. Welcome to the schism between us.
So I don't remember pre-crisis Northgate.
Oh.
Because I was maybe 1 or 2 when that happened.
Okay.
That was around 2000, and I was born in 98.
That's right.
So I grew up in a very small version of Northgate.
Yeah.
And I grew up in the version of Northgate that was using a combination of Mennonite Brethren and General Conference resources.
Yes. Yep.
The voices you hear there are mine and my grandmother's. One thing you should know about Elfrida? She's 85 and the biggest BC Lions fan I've ever met. And the church we're referencing. Well, that's the church I grew up at. Northgate Mennonite Brethren Church, which, incidentally, no longer exists.
There was one couple that was from the General Conference Church. Yeah. And the other thing was that I became the office person and actually became the administrator in the church. And so I was open to getting resources from different places.
Mm-hmm. Because you had now this long experience with collaboration.
Yes.
Side note. You'll sometimes hear the Mennonite Church referred to as Mennonite Church Canada, MC Canada, the General Conference, or just GC. For the purposes of this story, those are all referring to the Mennonite Church in Canada. Similarly, you'll hear Mennonite Brethren and MB used interchangeably. Both refer to people and churches within the Canadian Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches. Back to the story.
So from Richmond, we moved to Dawson Creek, not to be in a pastorate, but to be lay people, because John had he had been kind of forced out of the Richmond church. So there was a time there when we needed some years of healing.
My late grandfather, John Klassen, was a pastor who spent his life pushing the boundaries of the MB Church. He was seeking to be a good neighbor, but he also stirred the pot a lot. So when my dad was a teenager, their family moved from Richmond up north to Dawson Creek.
We were part of the church there. The pastor we knew from previous years, he was about ready to retire, and then it sort of automatically became that Grandpa would become the next pastor. We lived there for about 2 years, and then he quickly became part of the Ministerial Association. Mm-hmm. People immediately could identify his gifts, that he was a people person, and he just immersed himself in the church and in the community. Mm-hmm. In a sense, he also became the pastor of Dawson Creek.
John invested in the town way beyond what his job as pastor at Northgate required of him. He just loved people. And no matter what, he was going to be there to support his community, even if and when that community did not fall within his own denominational lines.
He eventually became the chairman of the Ministerial Association. So that was very ecumenical as well. The Catholic Church, the Notre Dame, was part of the Ministerial Association, as well as the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and some independent church groups were all part of this Ministerial Association. So it happened that it was a Unity Sunday. Anyway, he was invited to preach at the Notre Dame Church.
Wow.
As an MB pastor. And it was a Unity Sunday, so that's what his theme was. Mm-hmm. But then when it came time for the Eucharist, he couldn't take communion.
Yeah.
Because he was not a Catholic.
Yeah.
And so it was such a paradox.
No
he
kidding.
Spoke on unity of the church, but he couldn't take Eucharist.
So bizarre.
I know.
Oh, man.
I attended the Catholic school in town, and later, I went to the youth group at the Alliance Church. For my formative childhood years, I had a sort of assumed ecumenism. I never thought twice about churches working together. Then, the summer after my grade 7 year, my dad left his job. And then we moved to Abbotsford when I was 13.
Yeah.
And I went to the Mennonite MB school that was basically just MB. I attended Mennonite Educational Institute, or MEI. It's one of only a few institutions across Canada that is supported by both the Mennonite and MB regional churches. And yet, my experience of it was far from collaborative. And I just realized, oh my gosh, there's a lot of conflict here. There's a lot of like distrust is maybe the word. My Abbotsford years coincided with adolescence and a kind of waking up to the world. They were tough years. I had been raised to be curious and to ask questions, especially about faith. But at MEI, I often experienced my questions to be hushed and frowned upon. And ideas about faith landing in the real world in the forms of peace building or justice were seen as almost heretical. Long story short, I left the MB Church at the dawn of my young adulthood. I left because of a specific church conflict, but in hindsight, I also left in an effort to protect myself from the harms I was already witnessing by age 19. Conveniently, I moved to Winnipeg for school, right as everything went down in my home MB congregation. And so I quickly found a congregation that felt good enough to join. I transferred my church membership there within 6 months of attending. Suddenly, after an ecumenical upbringing with a home base in MB land, I was a Mennonite.
It wasn't until 1975 when I became an MB, when I started going to an MB church, that I learned that there were actually different kinds of Mennonites.
This is John Longhurst. You may know him as an esteemed journalist of religion or a member of the Order of Canada. I know him as a new friend who's been disappointed by the church one too many times.
I was told there was this pastor near my house at a church, and he was really good about talking to people who were fed up with the church.
Yeah.
And I just walked in one day at Grantham MB Church and knocked on the door. You could walk into churches back then, they weren't bought. And Aaron Schmidt was the pastor.
Okay.
And he stopped whatever he was doing, and he talked to me, and he said, "Why don't you come back?" And that's how I became an MB.
John has spent most of his adult life as a member of the Mennonite Brethren Church, and has had a career writing the faith column for the Winnipeg Free Press. I suppose you could say he's thought a bit about how religion works.
When I asked my new friends at the NB Church in 1975, what's the difference between this church, which I've now started attending, and that other Mennonite church, which was literally just blocks away off the street, I was told, so this is 50 years ago, that we were Christian and they aren't, right?
Even going back 50 years, John isn't talking about an inciting incident or any kind of original conflict here. What he's recalling is a symptom of a much deeper wound, an older schism. I want to introduce you to someone else whose voice you're going to be hearing throughout this series.
Start with the first one, the 1860 split.
That's Bruce Gunther, scholar of church history and Mennonite studies, and self-described Canadianist. We met this past January in his living room in Abbotsford, BC.
You've got a bunch of Mennonite colonies scattered across sort of Imperial Russia. And this is like 19th century, so 1800s. They've been there for multiple decades.
The Mennonites, who came out of the Anabaptist movement of the Radical Reformation, had been running from persecution and towards religious freedom for several hundred years by now. They had struck a deal with Catherine the Great, who let them speak their language, a dialect of Low German, abstain from military service, and farm in South Russia, the area we now know as Ukraine. It was largely good enough.
They are still locked into several large colony areas. They're not allowed to expand. Legally, they're not allowed to expand much, but mostly not. This is far enough away from their roots in the 1780s when they arrived here. Yeah. So, 40, 50, 60 years. To me, one of the driving problems that precipitated the MB split was the problem of nominalism or cradle Mennonites, which usually doesn't come to mind when we talk about cradle Anglicans all the time.
Right.
But that was the problem here, where Mennonite identity came to be associated with birth.
Bruce tells me about nominalism, a problem that arose among the Mennonites in South Russia when, despite coming from a rich lineage of radicals, they began to lose their spiritual fervor.
And over time, baptism becomes not just a spiritual symbol as it had been amongst the Anabaptists and the Mennonites. It became also a doorway of permission for marriage and land ownership. And then with land ownership came the opportunity to participate in decision making in these colonies.
A key piece of Anabaptism had long been the separation of church and state. This was true right from the beginning of the movement. But now, a few hundred years on, things like land ownership were starting to be mixed up in things like baptism, which had long been a matter of faith and church.
During this 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s sort of time period, and the kind of escalation of pastoral problems that they were seeing in the colonies, drunkenness and violence, and undue political interference on the part of village leaders in the church and the church vice versa. This was an unhealthy church state type of relationship.
All was not well in the Mennonite colonies.
And it's in the midst of this that there's also then a curiosity and an interest in spiritual renewal in the life of the church. These are all people who are part of the Mennonite church. And yet this is not what people had expected church to be. And so you have Bible study groups, you have a search for literature, German-speaking Lutherans who have been influenced by the Pietist movement, which is an internal spiritual renewal movement within Lutheranism. That's how it started. And some of those ideas resonated with Mennonites in these colonies as a response to this problem of nominalism. To make a long story short, I think the MBs grew out of the search for spiritual vitality or renewal within the Mennonite church.
As I listen to Bruce talk about this context to the beginning of the MB movement, I can't help but get excited. I love a revival movement, and I get excited about the prospect of a group of people reinvigorating their faith and learning to live it out in a bigger way.
And there were some pastors who were opposed to these extra outside of church activities and influences, and then there are those who were warmly supportive and encouraging. Anyway, it was controversial.
This brings us to 1860, the official year of the split, or, to put it differently, the official birth year of the Mennonite Brethren Church.
Is it the Mleczna colony, I think, where the MBs first start, and there's this point of conflict, and there's the threat of imprisonment, and church leaders who object to some of this stuff happening, using then the instruments of the state to impose their. All this stuff is just so off, and so ironically off for inside these Mennonite colonies. So the MBs, they make this pronouncement in January of 1860, and it's pretty harsh, and so that doesn't help actually in setting the tone of this conflict.
The stage is set. As I sit on Bruce and his wife Lois's sofa, the rain gently hitting the living room window, I realize I'm starting to get the answers I've been looking for. But there's also a lot I don't know yet.
Well, first thing I would say there's at least two different stories.
That's John Longhurst again.
If you're older, there's a different story. You have a different story from your past than you or your generation has about MBs and Mennonites today. So, in the early to mid 1980s, John Redekop, he spearheaded an effort for the MBs to apologize to what was then the GCs. So in the period up until then, if an MB young person married a GC young person, the MB young person was excommunicated. Yes. And if you're older, you remember that. That's in your head. That's what the stakes were. You'd be forced out of your home church. And so John Redekop led an effort to apologize for that.
I grew up knowing this, not about John Redekop's effort toward reconciling, but knowing that in my grandparents' generation, there was stigma and fear around straying too far from your denomination. My generation has mostly moved beyond this level of animosity.
People in your generation are much more ecumenical, maybe even interfaith. What are you folks arguing over? Over which form of baptism is? I mean, give me a break, right? But that was a real issue 80 years ago, 50 years ago maybe even. But it's not an issue today.
So why am I here? Have we moved on? Is there even still tension? Is there even a story to tell?
Your generation has deconstructed a lot of that stuff. Yes. Just not important. Whereas for your grandparents, that was worth dying over. So what does it mean to be Mennonite? Or is it even important anymore to be Mennonite in Canada? If you could stop everybody in this coffee shop and ask them, what do you know about Mennonites? Probably 50 to 80% would say Mennonite Central Committee. And a couple might know Mennonite Disaster Service, but nobody could tell you about Mennonite theology, Mennonite differences, 26 different kinds of Mennonites. Maybe Mennonite means nothing.
I'm not so sure. My experiences in Mennonite and MB communities tell me that there is a lingering identity, whether or not it's often articulated.
My broad impression of the MB world in the lower mainland of BC was that Anabaptism was slowly and then maybe quickly being replaced piece by piece by more evangelical, more charismatic, more reformed values.
I've had a growing hypothesis that, especially out west, the culture and theology of the MB Church in Canada is shifting, moving away from its original Anabaptist roots and deepening its relationship with American evangelicalism. After speaking with Bruce and with John, I've learned a lot, but I'm left with more questions. How did we get from A to B to C? I'm starting to understand what went down in Russia, but I can't shake my own feeling that the tension still isn't resolved. Where are we? And where are we going next?
St. Stephen's University is a graduate school of theology, peace, and reconciliation, dedicated to cultivating students who wish to pursue justice, beauty, and compassion in our fractured world. Offering an array of certificate and master's degree programs in theology and culture, peace and justice and reconciliation studies, SSU programs are designed so students can upscale their education without ever needing to uproot their lives. Drawing on the wisdom of a broad spectrum of scholars and activists and theologians, students have the opportunity to engage firsthand with an array of guest lecturers, including Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac, Lisa Sharon Harper, Pete Enns, Oshita Moore, Brian McLaren, C.C. Jones Davis, Bradley Jerzak, Stanley Hauerwas, Shane Claiborne, and many more. So whether you've been in ministry for decades or are just starting out, if you want to deepen your theological reflection by asking the hard questions, or are looking to find pathways to pursue healing justice in your neighborhoods, SSU's learning community is open to you. Applications are now open for all of SSU's programs. Classes begin in September. For more information, visit us at ssu.ca or email info@ssu.ca.
Last year, on a Tuesday in October, I met up with a guy named Cam at a Tim Hortons in North York, and I bought a field recorder off him. I was living in Toronto at the time, and I started playing around with my new toy.
I say something,
Hello.
and then you say something.
Hi, I love you.
I was hitting the road, or more accurately, the skies, traveling across the country to ask my questions. And it wasn't always going to be easy.
So now I'm recording a little test thing. Tell me a bit about yourself.
This is Marta coming to you from the kitchen sink.
I'm sitting at a red light right now at Cross Street. That if I turned left, I would eventually get to the church I used to go to, the MB church I used to go to when I was in high school. I don't know how much of that I'm going to talk about on this podcast. I was born into this conflict. In many ways, it's been a defining story of my own life. It's messy, man. This church thing, it's just really freaking messy. I don't know how to deal with it sometimes. Like, how do you grapple with all the good and all the painful? It's just like all together, you know? This is it. The real stuff of life. How do we hold it all? Can we even? The church is messy, and it's hard to stick with it sometimes. But I wanted answers, and I wanted to live the questions. I want to live the questions. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, we will gradually, without even noticing it, live our way into the answers. Thank you for listening to The Schism Between Us. I'm your host, Marnie Klassen. This series is supported by Menno Creative, a program of Canadian Mennonite magazine. Special thanks to Will Braun and Susan Fish for their ongoing support. I could not have told this story without the help of some very special folks. At the beginning, you heard an arrangement of In the Rifted Rock, arranged by Michaela Turner and performed by Marta Bonnet-Wiebe, Allegra Friesenepp, Matthew Veith, Solomon Schlegel, Courtney Kuhl-Schlegel, and Isaac Kuhl-Schlegel. The other music you heard throughout was composed and recorded by Jamie Terpstra. Graphic design by Tiff Wu. Technical production by Matthew Veith. Thanks to all of these friends and colleagues, without whom this project would still be just an idea. And thank you, dear listener, for listening. Catch you next time.